Hi, this is Steve Hoskinson, and welcome to the End of Trauma podcast. Do you have any of these things, and do you wonder what they all might have in common? Feeling stuck or procrastinating, being super shy or super sensitive or introverted, or if you have great ideas but don't seem like you can ever get them enacted, or something seems always to be getting in the way, or if you tend to freeze, or maybe really even just feel really different or alien, or if you sometimes think like, oh, sometimes I get so anxious I can't move, or often I'll just sit and stare, or people have called me a space cadet a lot, or I get lost easily. Or if you have like chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, migraine, what do these things have in common? Well, at the end of trauma, we're trying to help demystify these as physiological processes. These are things in the biology. And in particular, today, we're going to look at one of the aspects of the biology that really gets people stuck, and that means really disorganizes a system from its natural rhythms of synchronization. And I'll talk about why that is, but what we're talking about now is the freeze or immobility response, or when this system that the eminent psychophysiologist named Stephen Porges calls the dorsal vagal system from his Polyvagal Theory. We're going to talk a little bit about that today, about the freeze response, not so much about how adaptive it is, because now in the trauma world, we are well acquainted with this idea that our survival responses include fight and flight and freeze. And all of that is very helpful, very adaptive, and really has gotten us to survive till this day. So, for instance, the freeze response was made famous by the North American marsupial, the possum. But it's not just the possum who has this freeze response. We do too. We have it too. And it's super helpful in situations of danger where, for instance, it's a predatory situation. If a young person, for instance, is raised in a really violent home, then freeze means that the person will be immobile and will be not very emotional, won't be attacking, and then will not be a threat and won't promote or provoke any further attacks as much as possible. So it can be super adaptive in terms of surviving, or it's also super adaptive because this phase is a oxygen conservation phase. One of the best ways to think about this dorsal vagal response or this immobility response is in terms of how well it works for oxygen conservation. You know, you often hear stories, maybe once a year, of, say, a young person who was, who fell, fell into icy water, and they were in that icy water for 10 or 15 minutes, and seemingly not breathing. And then they're able to be very carefully and strategically revived, and often without brain damage. That is because the system, our biology, goes into this kind of hibernation state of this freezy business and slows down all the uses of oxygen, right? And so that conserves and preserves the brain long enough that maybe life-saving measures can be taken. Maybe one of the best ways to think of freeze is like the brain's backlog of processing. It's just got too much processing to do, and so there's a big backlog. And so it shuts down extra stuff. So it shuts down things that might be extra. Out here in California, for a time, our demand for power and electricity exceeded the production capacity. And that exceeding demand then was met with what we had out here, which were rolling blackouts. Because if the entire system kept on making this demand, it would blow the circuits and it would blow the whole system. The whole system then would break down. So instead of that, they would shut down areas and just turn off the electricity in certain areas so that the whole system didn't collapse. And those rolling blackouts are kind of what you could think of as the biology doing, and just shutting things down that might be better than having the whole system fried. So for the biology shuts down these things and shuts down like the processing or access to sensation, emotion, and movement. And then that gives the brain a chance to catch up without that extra processing of, say, sensation awareness, or without emotional expression or emotional processing so much, or without mobility. There is much less for the brain to process, and so it can often then catch up and begin to function again with its full range. It's just a bandwidth issue. That backlog of processing means that the bandwidth has been exceeded by the demand for processing. So just reduce the demand on processing through like sensation, emotion, and mobility restriction, and the brain can catch up. In the meantime, this system, often, like all biological systems, values stability and values sameness, because the biology says no matter what else and what other impulses for growth and development, the main thing is let's not fall apart. Let's not change, because even if the system isn't working that great, it's working. And working is better than falling apart, because a system that falls apart is a system that is disintegrating and may not function and may actually collapse and die. So, as usual, all of these states are self-reinforced. What are the ways, then, what are the common ways that the freeze system reinforces itself? Sometimes the what's wrong attention or the negativity bias in relationship to freeze comes across in these kinds of thoughts. Thoughts like, what's wrong with me? Why is this happening? Or, it's always been like this, and it'll always be like this. Or maybe sometimes people have the suspicion like, oh, I'm just broken, or there's a hopelessness or helplessness. Sometimes it's like, oh, I should be able to do more, or shame in particular. Because these thoughts and then shame in particular has this other reflection that comes right out of the biology. So first thing that I would want you to know is you don't create this phase. Helplessness, stuckness, not being able to do stuff. This is not your problem. It's not your psychology. It's your biology. So you are suffering these conditions. And people who have a lot of this, and there are a lot of us, we are suffering these conditions. And the suffering is exquisite because often we look just kind of okay or just sort of even non-responsive. Right? Because that lack of mobility means our faces that maybe aren't showing a lot of emotion. We're not moving a whole lot. We are, however, tremendously sensitive. The lack of sensation and the trance-like capacity of all of this analgesia, this lack of sensation means there's less pain on the one hand, but it also means I feel everything. The usual buffers that people may have or the usual filters just aren't there. Sensation, like the feeling of, like I can distinguish between parts of my body and can recognize where I am in space, like that notion of getting lost easily or being kind of clumsy or klutzy. This means that my mapping is off. I can be disoriented and even spacey, right? So I may look like I'm not really responding, but because the sensation isn't available, because I can't really locate myself in space, because I can't feel my sensation so much, it looks like I'm not responsive, but because of that lack of boundary, there's no filter. So everything is coming in, which just adds to the backlog of processing. So sometimes you think about, people who are told that they're on the spectrum, and when they get into therapy, people who are shut down often then are just really in distress because there is so much going on. There is so much emotion. There is so much heightened sensitivity, but it's hard to speak. It's hard to get it out. It's hard to communicate. And it's this, really terrific suffering. And so the first thing is, if you have some of this, then just know that the place where we would begin is by knowing it's not your fault. And that's a counterpoint to the shame that is so often a part of this process. There's kind of a classic interactional style that'll happen where if we're in a partnership, then one person may get going and really want to resolve conflict, but at some point their partner may go over threshold and then go into a kind of freeze where they can't communicate. And then their partner is saying, "Oh, you're withdrawing. Why are you withdrawing?" And the person doesn't know, of course. It's just like, "Oh, I don't know. I'm confused." Often mental confusion goes with this. And so it can really be then quite problematic. And it's problematic in part because that lack of sensation and the lack of mobility and the lack of emotion is a deadening-like state. And because it is also this state where I can become like invisible, and that sense of invisibility is really adaptive if you're in a dangerous environment. Like I am, nobody's here, nobody's causing any threat. But on the other hand, I need that sense of validation and presence. I need to feel like I am somebody and I am here. But very often with the shame, the feeling is like also often a question of, do I exist? If I can't feel my body and locate my sensation and feel emotional responsivity in a well-calibrated way, I often feel like, do I exist? Do I have a right to exist? Does anybody know I'm here? Am I alien somehow? And this is really an exquisite suffering for people. So if you have this, just know that this is not your fault. This is the biology expressing itself. This is a conditioning system. And the good news for this is that although it is conditioned and it is long-standing and it is a challenge, it can be unconditioned. It might take some time, but we begin with the work with the what's wrong attention, and that begins with knowing it's not your fault. You didn't create this. It is being self-reinforced in your system, and in this time I'm going to begin to talk about some ways of coming out of it. The reason I'm talking about this today is that I'm really engaged with our program, the End of Trauma course, and we're talking about the work with image. And the work with image, each week we're going through our categories of experience, and I have an acronym for that. It's called ISOMA, because everything begins with the soma, with the body and with the physiology and with the biology. And so we're beginning in this second week of the End of Trauma course with image, because image is so important and is such a resource that becomes available when people's biology has a default toward freeze or has lots of freeze. So there are ways out that we may think are impossible or may think are unlikely. Mostly, when you have a bunch of freeze, then, or Freezy Business, I call it, there's not a lot of sensation, there's not a lot of affect, there's not a lot of movement necessarily, but there is the possibility very often of image and imagery and imagination. Really this state, because it is unmoored from orientation and connecting to the environment through the senses, and it is disconnected from the way that the body might respond emotionally or physically to the environment. I can be free for flights of fancy, and that can take a really negative direction because of the negativity bias and the what's wrong attention. I can imagine all kinds of terrible things, but on the other hand, I may be really creative. I may think of all kinds of amazing ideas and thoughts, and we're going to leverage that. We're going to use that imaginative ability and our creativity and our image possibility to give us some new resources for working with Freeze. So I hope that begins to raise your curiosity about this. And we're going to begin, though, with this beginning notion that our first response is empathy for oneself. This is of course problematic because this Freeze system has so much, really is the physiology of shame and dissociation, and it's because of this question like, do I exist? Do I have a right to exist? It ends up, a fancy term of it would be like existential doubt. Do I really have a right? Or, that sense of like, is there something like fundamentally wrong or broken? All of these thoughts are simply ways that your biology is sending be stable, don't change signals. So if we're thinking, maybe I can think my way out of this, I wouldn't be too confident in that side of things. We're going to learn some ideas and get some good thinking and some good theory and good science behind this so that you can use the channels that are more likely to be successful and more strategies that are likely to be successful in this End of Trauma broadcast and podcast. So first I want to talk a little bit about the science of this to give you just a little bit of background into understanding this. And in particular, then we want to take this out of the realm of psychology where it began and move it right back into the physiology where it really belongs, which is where we can really do something about it. The first thing is that, like in the early 50s, an anthropologist named Gregory Bateson, whose partner was an equally eminent anthropologist, Margaret Mead, Bateson discovered this notion and really began to uncover this notion of what he called the double bind, this negative double bind theory, because he was studying families with schizophrenic family members in it. And he began to really speak of this as schizophrenic families. And what they noticed was that families like this had a larger percentage, a significantly larger percentage of communications that were characterized by this negative double bind. And some examples of this negative double bind, it's basically a communication that is a lose-lose communication. So there's like nothing you can do in that. And that's like one of them is, like the be spontaneous. The command like be spontaneous. Or something like, you have to love me. That is demanding that somebody do something that is spontaneous. There are a whole host of these kinds of double bind communications in which there is implied communication, inability to take feedback, and so on. Another psychologist who framed this concept was Martin Seligman with the concept of learned helplessness, and noticed that dogs and others would be unable to respond to help themselves at times, and they thought of it in terms of social learning, but really were paving the way to the understanding and the look at this from a physiological perspective, which we hold now. the understanding of this and its importance for trauma, and the reason that we know it in terms of fight and flight and freeze, is really to the credit of my mentor, Dr. Peter Levine, who developed this notion of working with this, and because he was then in contact with a preeminent psychophysiologist who really dialed in and named the importance of what he called the dorsal vagal system. And this is Dr. Stephen Porges, who developed the Polyvagal Theory. And in the Polyvagal Theory, he made a crucial contribution to our understanding of the human nervous system. Back in the day, when I would be doing like stress talks and so on, we'd say, okay, stress is like having the brake and the accelerator on at the same time. Like having the brake and the accelerator on at the same time. Because the brake is the parasympathetic system, the side of the autonomic nervous system that is typically thought of as being for resting and digesting, rest and digest, or parasympathetic being like a parachute bringing your system down, or the accelerator, which is the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. And it's really the energy system, the fight or flight system also, by the way, for emergencies. And we would say, there are these two functions, the brake and the accelerator. But as it turns out, as you might expect, it's much more complex than that. And in the sympathetic side, like in the fight and flight, that's only for emergencies. But still, in terms of survival responses, it is both fight and flight. So one energy system, but there are brain areas, it's called the periaqueductal gray, but brain areas that are localized for each of those behaviors. So same energy system, same branch of the autonomic nervous system, but very specific and differentiated and different channels. Likewise, then enter Stephen Porges, who says that parasympathetic system that we thought was just one, it's actually at least two distinct branches. And he really defined and showed how these two branches are distinct. And they're distinct in their function, they're distinct in where they came from evolutionarily, and they are distinct in their physical architecture. So, and these two sides, he called the ventral vagal system and the dorsal vagal system. And that dorsal system is what we're talking about today, because that's the Freezy Business right there. And so the Freezy Business goes back, and he traces this back to the system of cartilaginous fish. So in terms of ancient, and my friend Twigg says this is a system that's older than bones. So this is ancient stuff. And so, this is a paramecium does this. It'll be moving along in the world, and then it might hit something in the environment, like a weird pH, the wrong acidity or something, and it'll go, and it'll stop. It'll have its arrest. And then it will locomote, it'll move around in a different area. This basic system of like stopping so that you're not a target of predators. Paramecium, obviously, I don't know what predators there are for paramecium, but there you go. This stopping is something that will often stop the attack of a predator, thus the possum. All of this, gets passed on because it works. So everything that we have and all of our systems are being passed along because there's something good about them. And we're going to talk about that later, because after I talk about this science, I'm going to talk about how to begin to cope with this and how to begin to deal with this by understanding the physiology. And a big part of that is going to be that we're going to use our OHI paradigm. Because the OHI paradigm is trauma means unintegrated resource. Trauma means unintegrated resource. There is ready in your system something to help you in this process as well. And we're going to be looking at some of what that is and how to begin to make use of those resources, begin to feel those resources and experience them so that we can really come out of some of our suffering. So Stephen Porges says that the other branch of the parasympathetic system is the engagement system or the social engagement system. And so when we are considering how to work with Freeze, the Freezy Business, we want to recognize that there is another side to this story, and that is that there is also the system of engagement. So if you've been listening to the End of Trauma podcast, you'll know how important it is that we are working in a way that takes into account and creates alternatives to the what's wrong attention or that negativity bias that I've spoken of. So that negativity bias, it comes across in these messages that I would mention about Freeze, like what's wrong with me, why is this happening, I'm broken, hopeless, helpless, it's always been like this, it's always going to be like this, I should be able to do more, or stuff like that. And so all of this negative messaging is what's going to keep our system stuck. And we are going to then make some different moves here to open things up and to get some different alternatives, but without having to end the phase. If you're a therapist and you're working with people who have any of the symptoms that I described at the top of this podcast, then you're going to want to know about this, because working with Freeze is something that is probably going to be characteristic of everybody who is really struggling and has had lifelong issues. So let's think about this a little bit. This dorsal vagal system, this Freezy Business, this is then we conceptualize this, we're thinking about this as just too much going on. Brain has too much to do, and it's just saying, okay, I've had enough. I'm gonna start closing things down here so I can just kind of catch up a little bit. So that the things that it shuts down, it's going to slow down on sensation awareness. It's actually analgesic. You know, when you think of Freeze, if you've ever worked in hypnosis or done trancy business, that's making use of this freeze state. And it closes down sensation, it closes down emotion, it closes down mobility. And you can hear it also because, you know, the opposite phase, that ventral vagal system that Porges is talking about, is engagement or social engagement. And so with social engagement, there is all this social interaction and signaling that's available. So the face is mobile, the eyes are in motion, the neck and head are moving and tilting to one side. You know, think of a dog who looks up at you and then cocks its head a little bit, and you just that's so cute, right? The reason we think that's cute, because that signals social engagement. My head tilts to the side. If you want to signal to somebody that you're listening, you tilt your head to the side, like, oh, how about that? And it's like a state of curiosity and engagement. So the opposite is true then of the dorsal vagal system of this Freezy Business. There is a flattening of the face, the muscles of the face, there's less movement, and there is also less movement in the voice. So as you hear me, you know, my voice is sort of bouncy, and it's got this rhythm to it, and it's got this what's called prosody. Prosody, it's like singing. It's this melodic quality in the voice. Instead, when there is this inhibition from the Freezy Business, it's going to slow down lots of things. It can slow down the heart rate. So bradycardia is what it's called. Like sometimes, you know, you go to the doc and the doc says, oh, you're so healthy, your heart rate's such a nice and low level. But if it's too low, then you're probably looking at some influence of the dorsal vagal system or this Freezy system. That's not true of athletes, by the way. Athletes have just more efficiency, and so they're going to have a lower heart rate, typically, resting heart rate. But there is also then, like, and I'll change my voice here so you can get a sense of it. Instead of being sort of bouncy, instead the voice will not have that melodic quality. It will lack its prosody, right? that kind of flatness, and often the voice will be soft also, and it will not attract attention. It doesn't have the kind of vibrancy, in part because the Freezy Business is an oxygen conservation system. So if you're going around and you're feeling like, oh, I can't really get a full breath, or I should be breathing more, stuff like that, all of that is just signaling, oh, the system's on conserve. And that's oxygen conservation, probably has something to do with the Freezy Business. So there are all these ways that the system shuts down, so in the attempt to be able to catch up on processing, but it doesn't catch up on processing because the what's wrong attention gets in there and just keeps it the same. So our usual strategies here are going to take a hold. One is we're going to try to nip that what's wrong stuff in the bud. We're going to instead do what we can to be empathic, and we're going to try to join with this phase rather than to try to get out of it by like breathing more or something like that. I'll tell you one way that people do get out of this phase a lot, and it's not super adaptive in the long run. A workaholic. You can become a workaholic or just stay really active. People find out that it feels so much better to be super active than it does to slow down, because when they slow down, it's like the freeze comes up on them and then takes them down, and they feel this sense of like body heavy and can't move and can't get things done, and lethargy and depression and all of that. So people stay really busy. Some people don't feel well unless they've run 6 miles a day, or they've biked 25 miles, or they have worked all day long. Hop up in the morning, that 2 cups of coffee, and then frappuccinos through the day, and Red Bulls, and they're staying busy, and it's work, 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 and then they collapse at the end of the day, hopefully get a little bit of sleep, and then back to work the next day. Work, work, work. So it's busy, 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 staying active, and they are just, how would you say, they're like taking a loan from the sympathetic branch of their autonomic nervous system and paying it then into the dorsal vagal account. And that keeps them busy, and it keeps them free until something happens. And then when something happens, I often see people in my office. They might catch a flu, or they might have a little fender bender, or something happens that interrupts the coping that they do by being active, and their system goes haywire and will sometimes collapse. Right? And they really then start to be like agoraphobic sometimes. People can't get out of the house because that's just too much stimulation. Their bandwidth has been so compromised that they're having to be really conservative about the stimulation that comes in. And it's not a bad idea. Going over threshold and having too much stimulation, don't really need that. And in fact, as we begin to think about strategies and ways to help your system in this approach, then that's going to be one of them. And one of them will be to reduce your stimulation a little bit. So let's begin to move now and think a little bit more about ways you can help your system if it is suffering from a little bit of too much Freezy Business. And part of the reason why we want to really get at this is because if your system has like this Freezy Business going on, or if you have clients that have this significant Freezy Business going on, then the arousal that happens from that system, plus the arousal that happens from the sympathetic system at the same time, like if you've got both of those going on at the same time, that's a lot of energy. And those two competing forces, like action and inhibition at such a high level, like a survival rate level, fight, flight, and freeze all at the same time, that is the lockdown that is the recipe for disaster for a system. Now, your biological system needs modulation, and the modulation are these ups and downs, like the sound of my voice going up and down, or like our ability to ride our biology, up in the morning with the sun and down in the evening with the nighttime. And those cycles of up and down happen everywhere in the body. But if the system is jacked up and it is stuck. Like the engine is revved, but the clutch is in. The clutch is going to burn out, and the engine's going to burn out, and the system will disorder. That level of intensity is one of the most disordering processes around, and that's why I mentioned, like at the beginning of this podcast, what are the things that migraine, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue have in common? That the system has desynced so radically that it is now sort of burrowed into some of the fundamental metabolic processes of the body. So it's important, if you think your system has some of this, to begin to try to chip away at this. And certainly our OI practitioners are trained in working with this, but there's a lot that you can do yourself. And for instance, you could take the End of Trauma course. We're working all along here to really build the resources that will help you out. And this week we're looking at images, and we're looking at the imagination, and really now working to give the resources and harvest the resources from your strengths. Because with Freeze, since there's not sensation, emotion, and movement available, orientation can be a challenge, but image is often available. My imagination, I can see pictures in the mind often. Not everybody can, but if you can, this is going to be an avenue to be able to find support. So one of those ways of using image in a way that is orientating is something that I'm doing again in these days in the End of Trauma course. I'm giving guided meditations that use imagery for support for these kinds of states. So the first one is to really catalyze and evoke and prime for states of orientation. So if freeze is disorientation, right? Freeze is and the dorsal vagal system is the physiology underlying shame and dissociation, disconnection. The opposite of that is this ventral vagal system that is orientation engagement, and it is supported by connecting to the environment through the senses. So that's going to be, in terms of the first thing that one can do, the attempt to stay more connected to the environment through the senses is key. That freeze system would have you withdraw your attention. So if you think of like introversion or shyness, you think of people being like withdrawn. And it's that the attention is withdrawn, and the attention goes inward and is drawn inward rather than outward. So part of our strategy is to bring the attention outward, back into the external environment, but in a way that sees the environment not through the lenses of the what's wrong attention, like, oh, where's the threat, what's the problem? That's hypervigilance. But instead, to have a neutral awareness of what do I see? Instead of, what's wrong, I just want to see the simple physical characteristics of what's around, because I've got to feed my brainstem a new message. The what's wrong attention, the negativity bias, would feed my brain signals from my own biology that would keep me and keep my system stable or stuck. We want to begin to grow our system. We want to really get a really positive reinforcement frame and get on the track of post-traumatic growth. And that will begin with really aligning with the physiological tendency and wish from the biology itself to be mapped in the environment. And that's orientation, connecting to the environment through the senses. What I can see, what I hear, what comes to my ears. Now, very often in this situation, we add thought to that. Oh, like, now I see that nautilus shell. Now I see the tree. Now I see this Totoro stuffed animal. Now I see this game that's on Jada's desk. All of these things then mean that I am bringing thinking into congruence with orientation. That helps, right? I get more channels onto orientation. And our ultimate aim is to be able to simply perceive things. So one of the gifts of the immobility phase is that I can meditate. But instead of meditating with eyes closed, what if I were to do this meditation, this mapping meditation of simple awareness, say, of the physical properties of what's around me? Now, again, in the Into Trauma course, we're spending quite a bit of time every day. You're getting guided meditations for this kind of practice. And one of them would be this, and I'll just do it with you real briefly, just so you can get a taste of this. So we begin with eyes open, and just let your eyes move about this space. And as you let your eyes explore, really let them free to roam and just see things that might seem okay to see. And if it's pleasant to see, that's fine too. We're really just looking for something other than what's wrong, something that seems okay. And when you see that, just notice, and then if you can, close eyes and see if you can see that in your imagination or in your mind's eye. And then we open again and let the eyes free to explore a little bit until they find something else that might look interesting. And then seeing that, seeing its physical properties, what's its texture and color, and how does the light strike it and reflect back. And then seeing that and then closing eyes again and just seeing what you can of something like that in your imagination. And then opening eyes again. And once more, and this time when we close eyes, we'll do something different. We'll actually see ourselves in the room or wherever you are. We're letting the eyes go and roam freely. And now we'll close eyes and just see yourself where you are right now. Now I'm just seeing myself sitting here. Obviously, one should not be closing one's eyes if it's not safe to do so. But if it is, then just see where you are right now. And see yourself there. And if it's just this extra thing, you might shower yourself with a little bit of love. Just a little bit maybe of warmth, even of physical warmth, of light like a warm sun. And just seeing yourself there and seeing that maybe your face brightens a little bit into a gentle smile. As you do that, we're just going to open eyes again and come back into the physical environment. Right? So that's an exercise where we are using what's available from the Freeze system, and that's the image channel. The image channel is often available to be able to help us get to orientation, which is to jump across the divide from Freezy Business into orientation, into the state of orientation, that ventral vagal system. So that's a trick. That's a hot tip for you, a way to support yourself. We're spending 8 weeks on the End of Trauma course, and people get access to all of these meditations and all of these informational videos ongoingly. That your membership lasts ongoingly. And so all of those resources are available for you. If you feel like that, check us out at the End of Trauma and on our website, Organic Intelligence. Here's some more ideas for you. One thing, again, that we begin with is just compassion. Like, let yourself off the hook of the thought that, I need to be doing all of this stuff. Like, when you start to think about all of the backlog, there is just too much to do. And you look at that to-do list, and it's a list of 100,000 things. So instead of doing that, which is going to keep us stuck, what if we just allow ourselves to wait a moment and then wait and see if impulse for movement arises? And it is better, to do something than nothing. And it doesn't, if you have a list of 100,000 things, who cares, right? I'm going to be totally behind forever. So what if I just am able to do one thing? But the job is enjoyment. And all that matters in the early stages of this is to do something that is enjoyable in the moment. So even if it is, I'm thinking, I should really work on my end of trauma journal, then what if I just pick up my pen and I look at the journal and then I place down the pen and place down the journal? I didn't even do it. I just took the first smallest step so that it could remain enjoyable. Right? That's positive reinforcement. It doesn't get into, I should do more. It doesn't get into me doing too much, and now I'm too tired. Now I'm wiped out. Right? All of that. We're leaving all of that behind. That's one thing. When we have the energy to do something, our first agenda, orientation, connect to the environment through the senses. Otherwise, we would look for a gentle movement. It could be a movement as gentle as sitting in a rocking chair. You ever wonder why people love rocking chairs, why babies love to be rocked? It keeps a certain amount of movement going so that the freeze troll doesn't get us as much. So that's another strategy. Another would be to just recognize and know that I need to reduce stimulation. What are the things that reduce stimulation? Well, I'm going to try not to worry, and then I'm going to be still. Maybe I'm going to cover my eyes with like a dark cloth. Maybe I'm going to turn down the lights. I'm going to reduce the amount of stuff my brain has to deal with. And another option for that, don't do substances. Don't do the intoxicants. That's going to, like alcohol as a central nervous system depressant, that's going to feel better. It is not better. So when we talk about orientation toward pleasure and doing the little things, this is going to be a real challenge because our system wants to get jacked up, go into sympathetic arousal of fight and flight because it feels so much better to be so active compared with the Freezy Business. That's going to backfire. It's just going to create more activity, more activation, and you're going to get the kickback then of needing the rest. And then when the system collapses, it just reinforces this message, which is negative reinforcement. The way to feel better is by feeling worse first. This is a super challenging situation, requires some subtlety and some real practice of doing less and appreciating more. Doing less, appreciating more. Totally fine to go on, say, an orienting walk where you're just walking as slowly as you care to and just letting the interest of what comes to the eyes come around. This system can get started early on. We look at imprinting, we look at pre and perinatal states. We look at all kinds of events where helplessness, where there's no possibility of active, fight or flight escape, and freeze is the next best thing. So this is going to take a little while. But I hope by understanding a little bit more of the signs and symptoms, of understanding some of the science, and then beginning to get some tools to work with this, that it can be of some help for you. All right. For more information, check our website, organicintelligence.org. I'm Steve Hoskinson. Thanks for coming and being a part of the End of Trauma.